which is in itself, it sounds crazy, but it is an amazing achievement that human beings have been able to not have a global war. Since the invention of gunpowder and dynamite and weapons of mass destruction, until the nuclear bomb was created, we've had world wars, once every 30 years. Even the American Civil War in 1850, 1860 was considered almost like a global war. Spain was participating, France was participating, it was a very violent war. So for the last 200 years or 150 years, we've had global wars, like every 30, 40 years, a major outburst of violence. Today, we haven't had a global war for over 70 years. And as a result, we also have become incredibly prosperous. So that's a good thing. Today, you can see that many times people are talking about the fact that, things are so terrible, terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, problems everywhere. And again, the news, we're seeing it every day. But as I pointed out, the news is also a little exaggerated in a one-sided way, because we only see the negative things. We only see the suffering and the misery. We don't see also the many good things that are happening in the world today. And so when people are focused on this very one-sided part of information and not learning, having learned yet how to deal with this new media, putting it into perspective and relativizing it, the tendencies for people to become overly pessimistic, and there's no real reason for that. Today the world, if I go back to, let's say, 30 years ago, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, that was the time of what we call the Cold War. And at the time of the Cold War, there was a political doctrine, it was called MAD, M-A-D. And it was, it was crazy, it was mad, it meant that, but it also meant mutually assured destruction. And at that time the Soviet Union, which was the communist camp, and the United States and NATO, which was the democratic and the capitalist camp, they each had about 10,000 nuclear warheads pointed at each other. 10,000, 20,000 in total. It would have created, if they would have launched a full nuclear encounter, a nuclear holocaust, it would have indeed led to a mutually assured destruction. It would have totally wiped out civilization in the Northern Hemisphere. It would have created an atomic blast millions of times bigger than the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. And at that time, we were living with this fear every day. In fact, historical documents have shown that during the period of the Cold War, which started almost immediately after World War II, you could say in the beginning of the 50s, that's when the Soviet Union got their first nuclear weapons. America, of course, already had a nuclear weapon in 1945 when they dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. Until 1989, when President Gorbachev ended the Cold War by dismantling the Soviet Union. In that entire period, from 1950 till 1990, 40 years, the Cold War was there, and during that period, at least historians have documented 4 to 5 times we were this close to that mutually assured destruction, to the total madness, human beings, civilizations annihilating one another with nuclear weapons. Today, that threat is still there a little bit, but it is incomparably less than it was during the time of the Cold War. And the most famous incident was the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the time when Fidel Castro came to power and he wanted to put nuclear weapons on Cuba, which was only 80 kilometers from Washington, D.C. And the Americans rejected it, and there was a direct confrontation between President Kennedy and Khrushchev about this issue, and it almost led to a nuclear war. So that Cold War period was so much more dangerous than the world that we live in today. In fact, in a sense, we can be much more optimistic about what's happening in the world today, even though some of the negatives that I mentioned earlier, even though through the media we are confronted with all this misery and suffering. If we learn how to place things into perspective, And if we learn to interpret the bad news in the proper way, because what is the bad news? The bad news is really that we're living in a material world, you know. And if you understand that this is the material world, and the material world is ruled by 4 principles: birth, death, disease, and old age. And although birth is considered a happy occasion, it's the beginning of something else, which is namely old age, death, and disease, which is not so happy. So once we understand that principle, then we are not surprised anymore. And then we lose some of that unjustified negativity. In fact, if we start doing what Srila Prabhupada recommended, is to start using everything in this world in the service of Krishna, then in fact, even the birth, death, disease, and old age part, and the suffering part becomes less relevant. It only becomes a transitional thing towards a spiritual life. And if you start using the world in that manner, then things will change. It will also change in a very fundamental material sense. You know, Krishna has explained, and in the Vedic literatures it is explained, that if there is a resurgence of spiritual consciousness, then human society will become more peaceful, there will be less violence, there will be less war, economically there will be prosperity, people will work together. It's like I said, you know, for the last 70 years we have not had world war. Well, the reason is that world war is because of mad or mutually assured destruction is no longer a possibility, because human beings are still almost as crazy as they were before and ready to go to war any time. But nuclear weapons make that impossible. Yet the result is that we have peace. And what is the result of peace? The result of peace is that we can actually work together, we can build things, we can create things, and we can have real prosperity. Even economists and historians agree, today we are creating more wealth than ever before in history. We are lifting more people out of poverty than ever before. If you look at the emerging economies like India and China, millions and millions of people are now being lifted out of poverty into a standard of living which we would consider to be civilized. And this is happening at a huge scale. And part of it is that there's world peace and there's global cooperation. Part of it is technological advances by which we become much more efficient in doing things and creating wealth and creating economic productivity. Part of it is also that people have learned how to work better. The whole art of management, for instance, the movement that started in the United States back already in the 30s with the time of the Industrial Revolution, the new phase in the Industrial Revolution. Part of it is how to teach people how to work efficiently. Management training, management structures, management and organizational concepts have helped people to become more efficient in doing things. So the combination of improved efficiency, improved management techniques, the combination of technology and global peace and cooperation have led to an unparalleled prosperity in the world today. And in fact, Srila Prabhupada has said that the Krishna conscious movement, and this may sound a little assuming or even arrogant, but I don't mean it that way. But he did say that this Krishna conscious movement may, under the surface, play an extremely important role in to bring about a kind of a global, you could even say revolution in terms of peace and prosperity. And it started already. In the Vedic literatures it is predicted that within the Kali Yuga period that we are in, and you all know that we are in Kali Yuga that started 5,000 years ago. Kali Yuga is a place not to be, but we are there, unfortunately. And fortunately also, within the Kali Yuga there is a period of 10,000 years which is called the Golden Age of Kali Yuga, which started 500 years ago. 500 years ago with the advent of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the incarnation of Krishna, who in fact changed the world. Even though historically speaking he is not today seen as one of the great historical figures yet, but that's only a matter of time before that will happen, because his historical significance is far greater than we can even imagine. And just look at it from a historical perspective. Around that time, what happened in Europe was the beginning of the Enlightenment. It was the beginning of the scientific revolution. It was the discovery of the United States. It was the discovery of really refining knowledge. Because before that, during the Middle Ages, we were living in total darkness. The average age of people in Europe was 30 to 35 years old. If you were 25 years, you were an old man at that time. And if you look at economic productivity from let's say 500 till 1500, 500 was the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire. 1500 was the beginning of the Enlightenment, which is around the time that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appeared in India. During that entire period, from 500 to 1500, there was zero economic growth in the world. And Krishna has explained that, you know, economic growth is also a symptom of spiritual revival. And if there's zero economic growth or even contraction, it means that human consciousness is contracting. And when there is spiritual advancement and spiritual development, then there will also be economic growth, because consciousness is expanding, activity is expanding, people become more efficient, more productive, people become more happy in what they're doing. Dharma means to be happy in the work that you're doing, to be a productive human being. Right? We spend a huge part of our life working. So to work efficiently and to work productively is extremely important, even in our spiritual development. So when there is spiritual development, then there is expansion of Dharma. And when there's expansion of Dharma, there's also an expansion of wealth and prosperity. From 1500 onwards, the beginning of the scientific revolution, and 200 years later, the beginning of the industrial revolution, we see an enormous increase in productivity. You know that a human being today produces 50 times more in his life than somebody who lived in 1600. 50 times more. I mean, that's incredible. In one lifetime, one person does 50 times more than a person in 1600, 400 years ago. So the advent of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the beginning of the golden age in Kali Yuga. And it's the beginning of a major transformation of human society. And in the end, it's driven by spiritual and karmic principles of a global macro proportion. Within the Vedic literatures, it is described that the universe is growing through cycles and yugas. And as I said, we're living in Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga started 5,000 years ago, normally lasts 432,000 years. And in some Kali Yugas, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appears. And it's a rare occasion. And when he appears, it's a great blessing for all of human society that happens to be born during that time, or around that time, or after that time. So we can see that in the end, the great progression that has been made, despite of all the negative side effects, because we can also say the last 500 years, is, you know, we had the French Revolution, we had the Russian Revolution, we had the American Revolution, millions of people got killed, we had Mao Zedong, who killed 54 million people, we had Hitler and Stalin. That's all true. A lot of very bad things have happened as well. No question. But it's also a process of, in a way, learning. If you go back to the 1930s, people were truly confused about, you know, what is the best economic and political system. Democracy was falling apart. Capitalism was failing because of the Great Depression. So guys like Stalin and guys like Hitler and Mussolini looked, all of a sudden, they looked fantastic. Wow, maybe these guys have the solution. Now we know that they were evil personified, and that this kind of totalitarian system of government is a disaster. So in the last 200 years, we have learned a lot. And the civil society that we have today, based on human rights, based on freedom of religion, and based in a way on spiritual principles, they're actually Vedic principles. If you look at the society that we have today, whereby, based on social benefits, the weak and the sick, the elderly are protected. I mean, that's never happened before in the last 5,000 years of history, that we've had a society where the weak and the elderly and the sick are being taken care of. That's a Vedic principle. Vedic principle is based on compassion, it's based on non-violence, it's based on helping the weak, and the strong helping the weak, and everybody working together and cooperating and building something wonderful. In the end, in the service of Krishna. And coming back to the same principle, if we do everything motivated by this principle, that we use everything in the service of Krishna, that all the things that we are doing on the economic side, on the political side, on the social side, on the scientific, on the knowledge, on the educational side, everything will become successful, because we know then how to cooperate. Without understanding the principle of cooperation, we cannot be successful in any field. And cooperation is based on what? It's based on the recognition that I'm the servant of the servant of the servant of the servant of the servant, which is the essence, the single most important principle of Vaishnavism and Krishna conscious philosophy. It's the single most important principle, and it is so simple. We all, in a sense, recognize it. Intuitively, we all know that. To be a servant, and a good servant, and the servant of the servant of the servant, and to be humble, and to be unassuming in your personality, and to be service-minded, and to take pleasure in service and in serving others. We all know that that's a good thing. So why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it? It's because of our ego being in the way, and because of ignorance. So the essence of spiritual knowledge, the spiritual knowledge that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu brought, was simply this. In the end, we all have to recognize that we are servants of Krishna. And what he taught, and one of his most famous statements was to be the servant of the servant, that to be humbler than a blade of grass and to be serving Krishna all the time. These are some of the most fundamental and essential principles that he taught. He didn't write volumes of books, although he was a great intellectual and he was a great philosopher, and he was considered at the time one of the greatest or the greatest intellect in India. But he didn't write volumes of books. In fact, he set the example of chanting Hare Krishna as a process of purification and serving Krishna, and to assume the attitude of being the servant of the servant of the servant of the servant. So we built a human society around this principle, and we spread pure goodness, then actually the goodness that we have already and the prosperity and the good things that have already been created will only become magnified. And then, as I said, that's really the power of this movement, even though this movement is a relatively small movement in numbers. But the principles that we propagate are so powerful that people that are intelligent and actually are willing to take the time to listen to it, recognizing that in this Vaishnava philosophy there is something so powerful there that if we adopt it, we can actually really affect the world in a positive way. And again, what is that principle? Just work together. Be the servant of the servant of the servant. Use everything in the service of Krishna. And we will have a golden age, and we will lift ourselves above the miseries of Kali Yuga and even all the negative news that we see on CNN every day. We can transcend it, but we have to have the knowledge. And the media, as I was talking about before, they are a great tool, but we have to learn how to use them. First of all, we have to put it in perspective, recognizing, yes, this is the material world. There is a lot of suffering in this world. A lot of things go wrong. But if we know that, and we also know that in the end, we are transcendental beings, that we are spirit souls. We are not in the end, even though birth, death, disease and old age is there, but in the end, we are not bound by these principles. We can transcend them. And by developing our spiritual consciousness, we can actually become detached from them. It is possible. If we learn it and we put that in that perspective, then it will not affect us and it will not turn us into a bunch of doom thinkers. Because there's a lot of doom thinkers nowadays. A lot of people are saying it's the end of the world is nearing, 21st of December 2012, the Mayas and the Incas and this tribe and that tribe, and they found the scripture there and Nostradamus, and they're all predicting the end of the world, you know. I don't know what's going to happen on the 21st of December 2012. Some say that the earth will start spinning in another direction. Some will say it will stop spinning altogether. Some will say a huge meteorite will, hit the earth, similar to what happened 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs got wiped out. Everything is possible, but according to the Vedas, this particular universe is bound to carry on for another few trillion years. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, unless you're worried about what's going to happen in the next 5 trillion years, or after 5 trillion years. But it's unlikely that, things are happening all the time, and the universe is not a very stable place, and there's a place where we see supernovas exploding, and solar systems being born and dying, and all kinds of violent eruptions taking place millions of light years away from us. All of that is happening for sure, but at the same time we also know that is a supreme controller who in a most unbelievably clever and mystical way is managing to make sure that all of this is functioning despite of all the instability. And if you really think about it, the fact that anything is functioning at all, is quite a mystery. I'm sitting here, my body is made of 80 trillion cells, and all of these 80 trillion cells, they are doing exactly, at least most of the time, not all the time, but they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And when I'm lifting my arm, that's not, it sounds like, it looks like a very simple gesture, but it's really trillions of cells and molecules and atoms simultaneously, going within a fraction of a second, creating an electrical impulse going from my brain to my muscles so that I can do this. It sounds like a simple gesture, but if you look at it on a molecular, atomic and cellular level, you'll see it's incredibly complex. And if you would look at it from the point of view of things failing rather than succeeding, if you would leave it to the laws of chaos, then nothing would ever work. And I could never do anything, including lifting my arm, or let alone giving a lecture about Christian conscious philosophy. And you sitting there and listening to it would be impossible. There's a law in nature, it's called the law of entropy. The law of entropy states that everything in the universe tends to move towards a maximum state of chaos. Everything, if you leave it unattended. But in reality we see that everything is working and functioning in a most amazing way. And that it's constantly being directed, even though from a statistical point of view and from a probabilistic point of view, it would fall apart within an instant. Yet it's all sticking together and it's working, it's functioning. Why? Because there's a higher intelligence. There's a force that's directing that to happen. The complexity of our universe, right down to the smallest atom, right down to the smallest subatomic particle, is so huge that without that constant intelligent interference and direction, it would fall apart straight away. Nothing could ever function. So despite all the constant uncertainty and the instability of this universe, both on a macro or on a micro level, we can still see that everything is functioning and moving on. And we know that if we use everything to the maximum in the service of Krishna, that it will only improve its functionality and things will only get better. And that's a law of nature. It's a very spiritual law, yet in the end it's the most important law. In the end the universe is driven by consciousness. It's not driven by atoms and molecules. Atoms and molecules are only, in the end, the expression of consciousness, and they behave and they move according to our level of consciousness. So the universe is driven by consciousness. It was created by consciousness, and it is our individual consciousness that shapes our own existence and our own future and our own destiny. So it's our responsibility to deal with that consciousness in the most positive way. And the best thing you can do with it is to become the servant of the servant of the servant of Krishna. Then we are fulfilling our natural position and doing the right thing and actually creating the most favorable circumstance, both for ourselves and for our environment. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free.
The force you were talking about